Many thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this week's video. So full disclosure here, I tried it when I first got serious with photography 10 years ago and was not happy with the results and basically just poo-pooed the entire idea ever since. But after revisiting this on a couple trips last year, I'll admit it, I was completely wrong. And in this video, I'll share with you what I thought the problem was, where I went wrong, along with the best way that you can set this up in your camera and how you can get the most out of this blended shooting mode. So to jump right into it, I've been shooting in full manual mode for most of my career and have never really strayed away from this. But a question I often get asked has to do with why I take this particular approach. And the answer is honestly very simple. So I shoot in manual mode because, and it's the reason why most people shoot in manual mode is because you want full control over your camera. I want to be able to select the aperture, I want to be able to select the shutter speed, and I want to be able to select the ISO. Those are the three main pillars of exposure in a camera. And I, as a photographer, want to be able to control all of that. You know, landscape photography is a slower genre of photography, so I have plenty of time to really dig into the camera settings and dial everything in. I'm not photographing sports or anything like that where the action is very fast. I have plenty of time to pick all three of those main exposure settings. So that's the main reason why I've always shot in manual mode. Now, a lot of people ask, why not aperture priority? Why not shutter priority? And although those camera modes are good for certain genres of photography, but for aperture priority, for example, you're basically telling the camera that aperture is your number one priority, and you as the photographer, you want to handle the aperture, and then the camera can go ahead and select the shutter speed. In shutter priority, you're basically saying that the shutter speed is by far the most important aspect of the photograph, and that's the number one priority, and you as a photographer want to handle the shutter speed, and the camera can handle the aperture. So me being, wanting to have full control over the camera, neither one of those scenarios really work out good for me. Now, when it comes to creativity, as far as camera settings are concerned, aperture, that impacts creativity. That impacts the overall visual look of your scene. F2.8 versus F16 looks completely different. Shutter speed, that impacts creativity. Shutter speed of 1 second with moving water versus 1/1000th of a second looks completely different. So that impacts creativity. Now, ISO, on the other hand, that really does not impact creativity. Here's a good example right here where all four of these images were taken at different ISOs. This is ISO 100. This one right here is ISO 3200. If I compare these, let's just zoom into a certain area here. This is the one at ISO 3200. This is one, I believe it's ISO 100 or maybe 640. But you can see, yeah, the ISO 3200 definitely has more noise, a little bit more grain up through here versus this one. But when you zoom out and you look at it like this, all four of these photographs look exactly the same. So ISO does not impact creativity whatsoever. All four of these images look exactly the same. The only thing that's different is the ISO. And that's a very important aspect of this is the camera settings that impact creativity. Aperture impacts creativity, shutter speed impacts creativity, ISO does not. Which brings me to the topic of this week's video, which is this blended shooting mode. Has become pretty popular throughout the years, and it's something that I tried before. I never really stuck with it after my initial attempt, but it's basically auto ISO with manual mode, or manual mode with auto ISO. But there's a very important caveat to that, something that using this combination, it unlocks an ability of your camera that manual mode does not allow you to do. So auto ISO basically is letting the camera dictate whatever ISO is appropriate to create that reasonable exposure, or 18% gray, if you will, in a particular photograph. And since ISO is not super important to the overall creative process, I'm comfortable now letting my camera select the ISO. Now, where I went wrong in the past is I never set a max level, and I'll show you how to do this in just a moment. I basically said that there was no max on the ISO, and the camera could pick out whatever ISO it wanted to. If it was ISO 20,000, it would be allowed to do that. And what happened was, since I didn't set that max level, I ended up capturing a lot of photographs at insanely high ISO levels that I would have never selected. And since I was using a camera that was 10 years ago, I ended up with a lot of photographs that I was super unhappy with. So that's kind of why I just stopped using this approach. But now that I have set that max ceiling on ISO, it has completely changed the way that I look at this. And since using this manual mode, I have control over the aperture. I still have control over shutter speed, which is by far the most important. but now the camera is going to take care of the ISO. Now, that's, I would say, 50% of the benefit of this. The next part is super important as well. But what this enables you to do is it kind of gets the camera setting aspect out of the way, because at the end of the day, camera settings, focusing on that is not really going to create amazing photographs. You really want to focus on your creativity, focus on composition, focus on, the things that really make a photograph stand out. So the more you can remove from camera settings, the more you can focus on the things that matter most. So what this enables me to do is by using the manual mode, but by enabling auto ISO, it also gives you the ability to use exposure compensation. And to me, that's one of the biggest benefits, because exposure compensation is super cool because you have the ability to dial things certain ways. So if you generally shoot, a third of a stop under, or maybe a full stop underexposed, you can set that up almost as a default to where it is always shooting that way. If you generally shoot overexposed, you can do that as well. And that's really, really nice. So the way you set this up in camera, of course, is you definitely want to put your camera in manual mode. That is the very first thing you want to do. And go over to your menu section. It's usually in the photo shooting menu somewhere is where you're going to say something related to ISO or ISO sensitivity settings. You can select that, and then you'll see something that says Auto ISO Sensitivity Control, and it's usually just on or off. If you set that on, you have now enabled Auto ISO. And then the next most important thing is to set that maximum sensitivity. You can really set it to whatever you want. I have been using it ISO 3200 because I find that on the Nikon Z8, ISO 3200 is still an extremely clean file. And with the advancements of noise reduction, it is super easy to clean up most photographs. In my experience, the noise that comes out of ISO 3200 on a Z8 is easily resolved in Lightroom or any other kind of post-processing software out there. But what this enables you to do is really just focus on creativity, and that's the most important aspect of it. I don't have to worry about my camera selecting ISO 6400. It will stop at ISO 3200. And if I take a photograph and it's at ISO 3200 and I feel that it might be a little bit overexposed, I can just come over here and select the exposure compensation and just dial it down a notch. And since I'm a landscape photographer, I generally do shoot a little bit underexposed. So the way that I have it set is to where I have my exposure compensation set at usually one stop underexposed. And then every single photograph I take will be exactly one stop underexposed. And then you can easily change that on a particular scene. So shooting manual mode with auto ISO is super, super beneficial. Speeds up the process a little bit, although that's not one of the things that I find the most beneficial, is because speed is not a real big aspect of this. But if you're photographing wildlife, birds, or tigers, or lions, or sports, or anything like that, speed is super important. So this is a very, very beautiful aspect that you could dial in for your camera as well. But as a landscape photographer, I think it just removes one more decision I need to make. And I also like to be able to have the access to exposure compensation, because if you've been into photography for a little while, you will realize that if you shoot in full manual mode, you do not have access to exposure compensation. And that's kind of a deterrent a little bit. Exposure compensation is a nice thing to have. But as soon as you apply the auto ISO, now you have access to exposure compensation, which is really, really cool. So I do hope that that information was helpful. I do want to say a big thanks to the sponsor of this week's video before I move on, which is Squarespace, who I use for all of my website and e-commerce needs. Squarespace provides a robust and beautiful online platform to develop your website. You can showcase your photography using Squarespace's new Blueprint design system to help guide you through the options to building your online presence from the ground up. You can even display your photography using Squarespace's flexible website design templates and customize the layout in order to make it your own. And with Squarespace's online store feature, you'll have access to all the tools you need to start selling your physical goods, digital content, or service products online with ease. So if you're looking to start a new website or possibly upgrade your current website, check out squarespace.com/Mark Denney for a free trial and 10% off your first purchase. So I do hope that information was helpful. This is definitely something worth playing with. And just to kind of recap it, put your camera in manual mode, turn on auto ISO, set a maximum level. I use my maximum level set at ISO 3200, and then start to play around with it. You can focus your camera at a light source and take that photograph, and then go ahead and review that, and then play around with the exposure compensation to see how that can impact it. And then just kind of take different iterations of that same photo And as you move your camera around to different light sources, you'll see that your ISO is moving around as well. Your aperture will stay the same, your shutter speed will stay the same, but you'll see your ISO moving around, and it will never go above whatever that maximum level you set in. And then it's really fun to just take a couple of photographs of some kind of light source and then use that exposure compensation to dial it in a little bit, take that same photo again, and you'll really start to get the hang of how this actually works. And like I said, it is quicker. It will save you a little bit of time. But for me personally, as an outdoor and landscape photographer, the most important aspect of this is, one, you do get access to exposure compensation, but two, it just removes one decision out of the whole camera setting process, the exposure triangle. And the more you can focus on composition and creativity in the field, I think is definitely a better thing. Time spent on camera settings is not going to really translate into beautiful artwork. So that is my take on it. If you have any questions about anything we discussed in this week's video, please leave those in the comments section below, and I'll do my best to get back in touch with you as soon as humanly possible. And if you did enjoy this week's video, if you could, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed already, and as always, I really do appreciate you carving out a little bit of time to spend it with me here today, and I will see you all next Wednesday. Bye.